And sadly, President Putin doesn't need an excuse to invade his neighbor, Ukraine, and to kill, as many thousands of Ukrainians and bomb their cities. So I think it's just a kind of desperate way to communicate himself out of a situation which is psychologically pretty testing for the Russians, who I don't think were expecting the Ukrainians to engage in this kind of activities, at least at that scale. And it's a way for the Ukrainians to signal to the Russians that they're not invincible, especially under Putin. And in a way, we can read that as the start of the counteroffensive. It's a way to shape psychologically the adversary and create a dynamic that hopefully will be favorable to the Ukrainians.
But of course, Ukraine has said that it's had no direct involvement in this drone attack on Moscow.
Well, I won't comment on the Ukrainian government's comments on these incursions, but I'm just looking at the outcome, which is to create a real psychological effect on Russia and on the Russians. And I think this is what matters when you are on the eve of a major counteroffensive, where the Ukrainian forces will have to regain both the geographic terrain, but also the psychological one.
So you are pretty convinced that despite those denials, Ukraine was behind this, even if it wasn't actually Ukrainian forces that fired the drones?
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the outcome of what happened today and the last few days, both on Russian targets in Ukraine, but also on Russian territory, the outcome is obviously interesting from an operational point of view for Ukraine, especially on the eve of counteroffensive.
Because we have seen previous attacks onto Russian territory, but they have been on a much smaller scale. This was a direct attack on an area of Moscow where many of the most powerful figures in the Russian regime actually live.
Exactly, but I think this is obviously keeping things at an abstract level. But self-defense, which is what Ukraine is exerting right now under Article 51 of the UN Charter, self-defense does not exclude having to intervene on the adversary in the invader's territory. So if Ukraine were to have been behind these incursions, which again, I cannot comment on, I don't have this information, they will be entitled to do so under international law.
We've also seen renewed large-scale drone attacks and missile attacks on Kyiv. Do you think we are entering a new phase of the war?
Clearly, we are entering a new phase where the Russians are trying to exert psychological pressure or renew the psychological pressure on the civilian population and their leadership by targeting Kiev and other big cities, and B, trying to pin down the Ukrainian air defense, which have proven to be very efficient and growingly efficient, and to pin them down in the major population centers so that the Ukrainian army cannot shift some of the air defense batteries to go and to be used to protect the forces that will be leading the counteroffensive. So I think it's already the Russians, in a way, anticipating a Ukrainian offensive in order to constrain some of the Ukrainian forces' options, especially in terms of force protection.
The United States has said that it does not support strikes inside Russian territory. Do you think that there is a risk that by these sorts of attacks on Moscow, very directly on the Russian elites, that it could risk undermining Western support for Ukraine, that countries like the United States might be more wary about the sorts of military support they're prepared to provide?
I think if it were the case, it would be a strategic misjudgment by the West, given that in the end, the warring force that is killing hundreds of thousands of soldiers, raping, attacking civilians in Ukraine, burning entire forests, polluting rivers is Russia. So at the end, I think we have one country that is the invader and the aggressor, and the other one defending its own population and territory. And I think this is the strategic clarity we have to keep in mind.
Because the British government has said that it does not believe that any British military equipment was used in these attacks on Moscow. And many nations have provided military equipment and weapons to Ukraine on the understanding that they will only be used within Ukraine's territory. Do you not think that there could be a risk of fracturing that unity that has been such a feature of NATO's response?
I think since the beginning of this war, what has been part of the success on the Ukrainian side in pushing back on the aggressor and against all odds, what has been part of that success, a key factor has been the Ukrainian capacity to redefine what we, the West, are willing to support and to supply. And I do understand the need for Western capitals, and especially the big weapon suppliers like London and Washington, to have some sort of plausible deniability in saying our weapon systems are not being used to reach beyond the Ukrainian territory in Russian territory. I do understand the political logic behind that. But on the other hand, I think what the Ukrainians have been doing very well is to constantly keep a balance and shift that balance towards us doing more and supporting more in order for the Ukrainians to prevail. We should remember at the end, this is a confrontation for a country to be able to liberate its territory from an occupier.
We've got an informal meeting of NATO foreign ministers beginning tomorrow. Do you think this will be discussed? And do you think that there could be some nations in the alliance that are concerned about what this next phase of the war might mean?
I think for sure it will be discussed also because of the longer context of having a leaders summit in mid-July in Vilnius. So obviously the foreign minister will look at, what are we going to decide and say on Ukraine, especially on Ukraine membership or path towards membership to NATO. However, whether there will be some split or some difference possibly, but there have been differences all along, but split a doubt. I think there's a clear resolve from NATO and actually NATO plus to support Ukraine in its effort to push back on the Russian aggressor and regain as much of its territory as it can.
Clearly, one of the concerns within NATO has been to try to avoid any escalation. But when you look at what's happening here, when you hear the latest language from President Putin and so on, do you think that there is a risk now of further escalation, of perhaps this war spreading beyond Ukraine's borders?
Well, I think the war has already spread beyond Ukraine's border in the sense that it has also, we have seen cyber attacks fomented by Russian entities beyond Ukraine in our own systems. We have seen energy blackmail. So we have seen Nord Stream 1 and 2 being destroyed, and we have still not fully attributed to it, but everything points to Russia. So I think the war is not just contained to Ukraine, and that would be a false premise. However, in terms of escalation, I think what we have to remember is that this is about how you control and manage escalation. It's not about not having escalation. It's about whether you can redefine the terms of the confrontation in favorable terms. And here we have to do everything for Ukraine to be able to redefine those terms in their terms so they can actually possibly at the end of this counteroffensive be in a position where they can engage into a meaningful peace negotiation or conflict resolution.
So you would like to see NATO in the immediate term stepping up its military support, providing the jet fighters that have now been given the green light to go ahead as soon as possible, and providing as much military equipment and backup as it can in order for Ukraine to succeed in this renewed offensive?
Providing combat aircraft to Ukraine is actually not just a short-term need, it's a long-term need, because they will need to be able to protect their forces, but also their population against the fact that there are high anticipation that the Russians are going to use increasingly their air force for the fact that they're also running out of options. So I think the use of combat aircraft is a question of survival of both Ukrainian forces, but also of Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure. But beyond that, I think NATO should not just be about supplying weapons. It should about supplying assurances, rock solid assurances that Ukraine's future belongs to the Euro-Atlantic order, that Ukraine is no longer in this state of ambiguity, which has actually been the cause of the war, where basically Putin has been exploiting that ambiguity, thinking that he could actually get Ukraine back in his kind of vision of this imperialist Russia. And I think it's important that NATO, in the foreign minister meeting, but more importantly in Vilnius in mid-July, make some clear decision to invite Ukraine to join under subject to the right security situation, to join the alliance, and in the meantime to have security guarantees so that the long-term position of Ukraine is assured.